So today we're talking about a lens that got a lot of mixed reviews and even some hate on it, and that is the Canon RF 100mm f2.8 L IS macro lens. And Canon did make some bold design choices with this lens, and some people really didn't like it, but in this video I'm going to tell you why I have actually used this for probably about 90% of my both professional and personal use over the last 3 years. I talk about why it might be great for you and why you might actually hate it. So first of all, welcome to my channel. I am Justin. I am a professional photographer and videographer. I shoot primarily product and corporate stuff. And here on the channel, I do gear reviews and tutorials for photography and videography. So if that sounds interesting to you, hit the subscribe button, like the video. But let's talk about this lens. And I bought this lens back in 2022, so about 3 years ago now. And I've actually never made a review video on this lens yet, even though I've been using it again for like 90% of the stuff that I've shot over this past 3 years. This lens is perfect for me, but it's not a perfect lens because no lens is. So in this video, we're going to talk about the good, the bad, whether it's a right fit for you. But first of all, let's talk about the build quality of the lens. So when it comes to build quality, like it or hate it, Canon RF lens build quality, everything about them is relatively uniform across all of their RF lenses. Plastic type build, using that plastic versus all metal keeps the weight of the lenses down. On this lens, there is also a focus ring. It is focused by wire, as again, all of Canon's RF lenses are. And then there is a separate control ring on this lens as well. And it has a 67mm filter thread. So getting to some of the stuff that is more specific to this lens, you do have a focus limiter here with 3 settings, basically the full focus range of the lens, just the macro, and then everything but the macro. And it is a true macro lens. You can do full 1:1 magnification, and you can actually do 1 to 1.4 magnification on this lens. That is really crazy, especially for a fully autofocus lens. Also on this lens, you have the typical autofocus to manual focus selection switch, the switch for turning the lens image stabilization optically on or off. And then there is also a control for spherical aberration, an SA control. That spherical aberration control is probably the most kind of controversial thing on this lens. Basically allows you to control the character of the out of focus elements on the images coming off of this lens. And I think that it got primarily reviewed pretty harshly and negatively when this lens came out. But when I saw those kind of negative reviews, what they were doing was cranking it all the way to one side or all the way to the other side and then comparing that with having it just turned off. And I mean, like, think about that realistically. Like, if you're in Lightroom editing a photo, do you take any effect and like crank it all the way to one side or the other? Probably not. Hopefully not. And so I don't think that's really a fair way to evaluate the spherical aberration control on this lens by cranking it one way or the other and then seeing if that looks good, because any type of effect cranked is probably not going to be exactly what you want. However, having said that, I don't use the spherical aberration control in this lens either. And there is a button to lock that control ring, so it just sits at the neutral setting. And I have had it locked at the neutral setting for the past 3 years that I've owned this lens. The maximum aperture on this lens is f2.8. It has nano USM focusing motors, which are very quick, very accurate. They're also relatively quiet in this lens, and I've been super happy. The minimum focus distance on this lens is going to be about 10.2 inches or about 26 centimeters. The lens weighs about 1.6 pounds or 730 grams. It's about 6 inches or 15 centimeters long. That length makes it where you are potentially not going to be able to set it up in your camera bag, depending on how deep your camera bag is. If you have a big super large Pelican case or something like that, you might be able to, but in a smaller camera bag, backpack, something like that, you'll probably have to lay the lens down, so it's going to take up more space that way. I will say that having this lens on the camera, because of the length of it, makes it not the best lens to try to be stealthy with. For whatever reason, even though like it's not the longest lens in the world, for whatever reason, when I've had this lens on my camera, it has attracted the most attention of any lens camera combination that I've ever had or used. Like, it has caused the most people to come up to me and say something about, oh, that's a big lens, that's a big camera setup, oh, super professional looking, whatever, just like randomly when I'm out shooting, than any other lens combination ever. And I don't really know what it is about this lens that causes that, and it could very well just be coincidence that that's happening, but noticeably more than any other lens combination, I get comments on this. So this is probably not the best bet if you're trying to be super stealthy and going out. It is not a heavy lens. While it's 6 inches long, it's relatively thin for that, keeping the weight down again with the plastic build. The limiting factor of being able to carry it around easily is probably the ability to fit it into smaller camera bags. It does also come with a plastic lens hood, and if there are other specs that you want to know, I would suggest you just go online to Canon's website or a camera store website and just look at the individual specs that I might not have covered here. When it comes to photography, now, I got this lens, like I said, in 2022, so about 3 years ago now, for product photography ability of this lens, which at the time, product photography was becoming a bigger and more important part of my professional work, and now it has become the main part of my professional photography work. And this lens is absolutely, as it was designed, perfect for that type of work. I just love the images on this, and I love the way that it renders texture from this lens, and that is due to, first of all, just it's really sharp, great color reproduction, great micro contrast, and a great amount of detail. So all of that comes together to just create really nice textures in images. As you would expect with a dedicated macro lens, close-up image quality from this lens is really great. And again, you have not just 1:1, but 1:1.4 magnification on a 100mm lens. So this is great for getting super close-up detail of even really tiny objects without actually bumping into that object if you need to. I will say I am not a professional test chart photographer. And if that is a large part of your workflow, shooting test charts, and you want to see how this lens will perform in a test chart shooting workflow, there are plenty of other channels where you can go and see how it performs in test charts. But if we look at this RF lens in comparison to its predecessor, the EF version of this lens, there is, on the RF version, better magnification. They are both sharp lenses, and I will say I have not shot both of them side by side to do a side-by-side comparison for this, but I think when it comes to sharpness, the RF lens does win out a little bit over the older EF lens. A lot of that is just the way that an RF lens can be designed because of the distance between the furthest element back to the sensor, so you're able to get more sharpness through the way that RF lenses can be designed. And then another thing that was always a drawback for a lot of people with the EF 100mm macro L lens was how it performed in like a portrait shooting situation, because they weren't huge fans of how it rendered the out of focus elements in the background. With the RF lens, I definitely think it wins out here over the EF lens, because I actually like the way that the RF lenses renders out of focus backgrounds at the neutral setting on the spherical aberration control. And then on top of that, you also have the ability to control that by moving that SA control either direction. So you just have more options for how the out of focus elements get rendered. Up until I bought this lens, I had been searching for an 85mm lens to update my Canon EF 85mm f1.8 lens with a better 85mm focal length. And actually, once I bought this 100mm macro lens, I started using the 100mm macro lens shooting portraits because I like how it looks and you get a little bit more compression from the lens being longer. So I actually just use this 100mm in place of an 85mm lens. And I did keep my 85mm, the EF f1.8 lens for a while in addition to my 100mm lens, but I've since then sold that EF f1.8 85, and for that kind of medium telephoto length, focal length in my kit, I just use the 100mm macro lens, and for portraits and whatever else I need, I'm going to use that lens. Now, I will say that shooting portraits is something that I used to do in the past, and I don't do that professionally now anymore. So that is, or not very often anyway, so that is definitely, and was when I was buying this and making those decisions, that was definitely something that I was considering. And if you are more dedicated portrait photographer, that might change. And I will also say that at some point I will almost definitely get another 85mm lens just because I like that focal length and I like shooting at that 85mm focal length. But for now, the 100mm does everything that I needed to do for that medium telephoto range. Also in this lens, you do have optical image stabilization, and for a macro lens, this is super helpful for when you're really close up on subjects and want to make sure that that handheld shot is still sharp and crisp and you're still getting the best amount of detail that you can. Now, I will say when it comes to image stabilization and photography, some people talk about how that's going to help in a low light setting. And while there are specific primarily niche cases where it can be helpful in a low light setting to have image stabilization for photography, with something in this focal length range, in order to have the image stabilization actually affect how much light you're bringing in, you would have to, for most people, turn the shutter speed below 1/200th of a second. That's roundabout where you would be able to typically hand hold a shot at 100mm on a full frame camera. And when you're slowing the shutter speed down that much, the reality is, unless you're shooting just a subject that is completely still, not moving, as in not people, not anything that's like trees blowing in the wind or anything else like that, nothing is moving at all. If there is motion in that shot, below 1/200th, you're going to start seeing motion blur from that. So the idea that having that image stabilization at this focal length is going to help in a low light situation is probably not accurate for most people in most situations, but it is still helpful to have in this lens, especially again with it being a macro lens if you're going to shoot handheld. And that optical image stabilization works really well both with camera bodies that do have in-body image stabilization and with those that do not have it. So I really like, as I said, this lens. There are some potential downsides for some people. One of those is that it is a prime lens and an L prime lens, but the maximum aperture is f2.8. So for some people, that is going to be a limiting factor where they would like to be able to open an aperture brighter, especially some people, the way they shoot portraits, again, would prefer to have like more like an f1.4 or f1.2 aperture. For me personally, that's not the case. I don't really tend to shoot wide open, certainly not past f2.8 very often at all. And when I am, that's a more niche situation. So for me, it's not a limiting factor, but it is definitely something to be aware of if that is a thing that you would prefer to have in your lens. I will say you're not going to find a macro lens at this focal length that has autofocus in it that is brighter than that f2.8. But if this is something that you're looking at for a versatile use case lens, then that is something to be aware of. And then when it comes to the size of this lens, as a lens that is a dedicated 100mm macro photography lens, the size and weight is not bad at all. But if we look at it from the point of view of being a prime lens in that medium telephoto range with a maximum aperture of f2.8, then in that situation, it is relatively large, and again, as I talked about earlier, less discreet. When it comes to the price of this lens, looking at it from the perspective of this is going to be a dedicated macro lens for someone who is a dedicated macro or like product photographer, for that use case, it really is not that expensive, and I think price for value is actually really good there. If you are looking at it from the perspective of this is going to be a dedicated macro lens for someone who is not a dedicated product or macro photographer, so I'm thinking someone like a wedding photographer, for instance, where you need a macro lens, but literally only for the ring shot that you do once per wedding, the value there is harder to, now it's going to do great in that instance, but you're paying a lot of money for that one single shot. And in that case, I think something like the RF 85mm f2 macro lens might do a little bit better there, because I do think that it's capable of doing that one ring shot. And then potentially that 85mm could be a little more versatile to you if you are someone who shoots 85mm prime throughout the day on the wedding. So in that specific use case, looking at the RF 85mm f2 might be a better value for the amount of money that you're spending. So when it comes to video, again, I actually love this lens for video. So very similar in the images, the same thing that applied to photography, because you're getting great detail, great micro contrast, great color reproduction. I'm using this lens when I'm using it in video primarily for B-roll type shots, detail shots, and this lens is a great lens for those purposes when you're shooting handheld, because it has the optical image stabilization built in. And the image stabilization here works really well with both the camera bodies that have IBIS, because it works together to give you more stops of stabilization, and good with the cameras that don't have built-in image stabilization. And that is even more necessary if it's a crop sensor camera, because field of view is going to be even tighter, and the tighter your field of view is, the more you're going to notice even little micro jitters in your footage. So having the optical image stabilization in this lens is super helpful. The downside of having optical image stabilization is that during panning shots, it can sometimes feel like it's working against you. And this makes sense, right? The purpose of optical image stabilization is to negate the effects of movement. And so when you are panning, especially in a slow pan, image stabilization thinks that its job is to negate the movement that you are creating, even though you are trying to create movement there. So it can work against you. End result of that sometimes is that you will have weird jumps where it tries to keep the frame steady and then jumps to where the frame is moving sometimes. But in any case, the reality is you cannot rely on image stabilization of any kind all the time. You need to focus on getting good shots, getting stable shots, and not having shaky footage. Image stabilization can smooth out micro jitters and make that look better and smoother. It cannot take a bad shot and make it look good. Autofocus from this lens in video is a great experience. Whether I'm using tracking or just single point, it completely keeps up with the modern autofocus systems in the mirrorless cameras and everything else. Just fast, accurate, super responsive, and I have not had any issues and been super happy with the performance of autofocus from this lens. Again, this lens has a crazy focus distance range, and so you will need to be aware of that and to be aware of the focus limiter. So for me, if I am not actively shooting some type of macro shot, I will have the focus limiter switched on to exclude that macro range of focus distance and then switch it to macro only when I am shooting some type of macro super close up shot. When you're doing it that way, it works super well. And honestly, there's not a whole lot to say here. This lens is just a beast for macro and close-up and detail B-roll type shots. The only complaint that I could really see here is that maximum aperture, again, of being f2.8 and not any brighter than that. For me, that's not an issue at all. I'm not realistically ever shooting wider than f2.8 because I want to make sure that my subject is actually in focus and actually detailed enough in the shot to see what it is and see the details on that. But for some people, they are going to want to open that aperture up wider than f2.8. And if that is something that you want, especially considering that this is a prime lens, a lot of people will want that. The option in a similar range here is going to be something like the RF 135mm f1.8L, which does also have optical image stabilization in the lens, but that is a bulkier and heavier and also more expensive lens than this. And the bulkier and heaviness of it can have the advantage of actually keeping your handheld footage a little steadier because there is just more weight and gravity is doing more work to keep that footage more steady. Again, you have image stabilization in both lenses, and if you're using good technique and shooting well, that shouldn't be an issue for your handheld footage. I have been, especially in the last couple years, trying to cut down the amount of weight that I have that I'm taking with me, that I'm using on shots, and that I'm putting in my camera bag and carrying on my back. So for me, the lighter lens of the 100mm macro, even though its maximum aperture is f2.8, is absolutely fine for me. Again, I absolutely love this lens, and I've used it for like 90% of the shots that I've taken in the past 3 years for my professional and personal work. And for about 2 of those years, it was actually my main walk around lens. Like I would just have this 100mm lens on my camera in my camera bag, and I might also throw in a 24mm prime if I needed to go super wide, but that was primarily what I was shooting on for everything. And part of that is just because I love this focal length. That medium telefocal length is where I typically like to live regardless of what I'm shooting. Can't always get everything in that focal length, so that's why I would also have a 24mm with me, but I love shooting that, and it worked great for, again, like 90% of what I was doing. And I will also say that now I am not regularly taking this lens out with me for daily use in my camera bag. And that is primarily because I am just trying to minimize the amount of stuff that I take with me. I'm trying to be more aware of what I'm doing to my back when I'm putting a camera bag on. And so I am cutting down just the size and weight and how much stuff I'm taking with me in general. Typically, if I'm just going out, walk around, camera setup, and I don't have some kind of specific goal or project that I'm doing on that day, it's going to be my mirrorless camera and then the RF 24 to 105mm f1.4, because that's going to be able to do basically everything. It includes that 100mm focal length, and it is also much smaller and lighter and more compact of a setup than having this 100mm lens, especially if I'm then also going to have something like a 24 or some other focal length prime or even another zoom in the bag along with it. But this is going to be the first lens I grab for studio work, the first lens I grab for 90% of my client work, the first lens I grab for any type of close-up or detail shot. But let me know what you think in the comments below. If you're looking for another video to watch, YouTube is suggesting that you watch this one that has popped up on your screen. Thanks for checking out this video. See ya.